My name is Renee Newmiller, and I'm the Director of Local and Global Engagement at Edenton Street. Today, I'm joined by Reverend Amanda Rigby and Dr. Elizabeth Waters, co-founders of The Well, a relatively new nonprofit that creates pathways for mental and spiritual care. Amanda and Elizabeth, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Renee.
Well, before we dive into The Well, I have a couple of questions. First, can you share a little bit about yourselves, maybe what you do in addition to The Well, and how you came about your individual callings to be a pastor, Amanda, and a therapist, Elizabeth?
Great question. I think many of you probably know me already, Amanda Rigby. I am the pastor of Christian education and spiritual formation here at Edenton Street in all my spare time. And so that is my other work aside from The Well. I also do some other things with the conference and just some things in the community. I get to co-lead a community group called the Reconciliation Alliance of Wake County, which exists to create a community for LGBTQ Christians. So involved in the community in a lot of different ways, and certainly involved in the church. And I always have been. I was baptized into the United Methodist Church when I was 4 months old and grew up in a congregation in Texas, which is where I discerned this call to ministry, and also where I think, tracing back the calling to this work that we get to do at The Well, that calling started there too. My own family has had mental health diagnoses generationally, and so that's always been an important part of my life, both mental illness and mental health. And so when I was 15, my aunt completed suicide as a result of her illness, bipolar disorder. And for me, that really traces kind of back the beginnings of what I think is a calling to the work that we get to do at The Well, just because I saw the stigma that was associated with her illness and with suicide. And I also saw how beautiful it can be when the church comes alongside someone experiencing mental illness or grieving the loss of someone to mental illness, in the same way that we might come alongside someone who died after a battle with cancer. There's a similar kind of grief and illness there, and the support that we received as a family in the church, I think really sort of planted seeds for what would eventually become this interest, this advocacy, and this care for people who experience mental illness, which is many of us, right? And so my calling into ministry, my calling into this particular kind of work was all sort of cultivated in the life of the church. And so it's such a beautiful thing all these years later to see how that calling has come to fruition, how that calling has put me in proximity to mental health care practitioners and others who have really inspired and even become partners in ministry, partners in this nonprofit practice that we get to lead together. So that's the short story. There's much more to it than that, but that's kind of how I got here.
Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. Kind of going off of that, just a little bit about my work background outside of The Well. I'm a full-time faculty person at Alliant International University, where I teach for their PhD and master's couple and family therapy program. So I love the work that I get to do there with all of my students. As a researcher, I dominantly focus on adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma and how that impacts biopsychosocial spiritual outcomes across key developmental periods, including adolescence, emerging adulthood, and later adulthood. And I'm particularly interested in resiliency factors and how those really help mitigate the negative impacts of childhood adversity. And kind of parallel to Amanda, growing up, I was surrounded by substance abuse, different forms of abuse and neglect in the household, poverty, and all of that really formed who I was as a child and as an adolescent who left home at 16 years old. And so going to college, I met Amanda when I was 17, and through the last 13 years have been deeply formed by this desire to help families that were in situations like I was in, where the system really failed to show up and the system really failed to intervene and create safety. And so there wasn't a safety net, and mental health care wasn't or didn't feel accessible for me and my family. And in many ways, I think many of my family members still feel that way, where it feels really inaccessible. So for me, this really planted the seeds of how do I help create a difference for children and couples and families the way that I wish someone had created that difference for me earlier in my life. And to say, though that's the resiliency, that's the grit that I carry within me, that can also then impact, because I do have different held privileges. And then I would say kind of the intersection of the church in that was deeply formative for me through my 5 years at Abilene Christian University as a closeted queer non-binary individual, and what it meant to really try to lean into spirituality, but then also be told that some of my held identities, there wasn't space for it. So I came in with this trauma, I came in with these repressed identities, but I was still deeply compelled by spirituality and this call to lean into a spiritual journey. And so our friendship through the years and now the work we're doing in this nonprofit for me truly is about how do we gain access to individuals that have been told that they're not enough or have adversity that they haven't had opportunities to have held in really safe spaces. To say, what does it mean to be Christian or spiritual and queer? What does it mean to be Christian and believe in a loving being or God, and have adversity and make sense of trauma and suffering alongside reconciling who you are in this lifetime and what you're experiencing, and also creating space for joy and healing and wholeness alongside that suffering. So I think, just to maybe put a bow on this introduction, Amanda and I have just both been deeply formed by these pathways in life that are filled with suffering and yet filled with deep, meaningful spirituality and connection. And I think that's really evident in our personal friendship and now in this nonprofit that we launched together.
Wow, both of those are really powerful stories, and I just can't imagine two people better suited to be doing this work. So thank you so much for that. And my second question before we kind of get into more information about the well is I think sometimes there's some confusion around terminology. And so I'm going to ask you both, but Elizabeth, we'll start with you. Can you just kind of give us a basic understanding, what is mental illness? What causes it, or some of the causes? And is there a difference between when we talk about mental illness and mental health?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to start with the last bit. I always look at mental health and mental illness as a spectrum, right? On one side of the spectrum, we can be really healthy, well-adjusted. We can have access to a lot of internal and external resources that help us cope with the stressors of life. And then as we move towards the side of the spectrum, towards illness and struggling, that's often where we see a number of factors. When we think about mental illness, there can be socio-cultural factors. So when we think about the globe navigating the pandemic, when we think about societal violence that's happening daily, those are all external factors to our internal well-being that impact our internal well-being, right? And then we also have epigenetic factors. So when we think about how trauma is passed down through our genomes across generations, then we also have intergenerational social patterns of trauma, how abuse, neglect, substance use disorders are also passed down socially across generations. So how I always come at trauma through this kind of spectrum lens of we have to really look at the biopsychosocial systems, the biological systems, the psychological systems, the social systems, and the spiritual systems of what is impacting individuals. We all have kind of natural predispositions to different mental disorders like depression or anxiety, just depending again on our gene structure and what's been given to us from those who came before us. And even without those predispositions, though I would say the vast majority of us have them living in a very trauma-filled society, we are constantly being exposed to trauma daily through mass media, through local community violence, state-level violence, and global violence. So really, in this age of technology, nobody can escape the influence of trauma, which impacts mental illness and sometimes can be the triggering events that trigger more complex illnesses like bipolar disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia, things like that. But I think when I say mental illness, I always want to preface to that we don't really want to say that with pathologizing tones or language. Mental illness, when we say illness, it's just a way of conceptualizing people are not well and they need access to resources. So I always want us to say this is not an individual problem. This is a systemic healthcare problem that we are often failing to address well and sustainably, where people, if given the right resources and time, would all be returned to that baseline of wholeness, wellness, and holistic health. And so even when we think illness, I never want to say that as a fixed, stagnant label, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it really does. And I think as you were speaking, the word holistic just kept coming back and into my mind, because it seems like, you're not just looking at a specific symptom or something. You're really thinking like, okay, what's leading up to this, and what are all the causes? Amanda, similarly, I think some people might not understand exactly what spiritual direction is. If you could give us a understanding of that and how it intersects with the mental health care work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and one that I think different people might have different answers to. So just want to preface by saying this is my response to that question, but someone else might say something very different. A different spiritual director, a different pastor might answer this in a different way. But for me, what I've come to understand in a lot of years of education and training as a pastor, and then years of training as a spiritual director, is that every single person, much like every single person has mental health, and exists on a spectrum of health when it comes to their mental state, we all are spiritual people. So regardless of how we identify with our religion, the way that we practice religion or don't practice religion, every single person is a spiritual person. And that's because we know, science tells us also, confirms this for us, that there's part of what it means to be human is this sort of undefined spirit, soul, some of the language that people use for that, that doesn't necessarily live in one particular part of our body, right? Like there's not like a spirit part of the brain, although we can see how spirituality impacts the brain. It doesn't live in one particular spot, right? And so that's the thing that we're talking about when we talk about spirituality. The thing that makes us who we are as individuals, that is deeply intertwined with our minds and our bodies, but is not just those things. It's this third sort of unique part of who we are as people that animates us, that gives us life, and that is really the core of who we are. And so for me, as a pastor and a spiritual director, when I think about spirituality, I think about the health of that part of us. Like, how are we, as these unique individuals, and from our tradition, right, unique individuals created by God, how are we thriving in our spirits? How are we thriving in our souls, or are we not? And I think similar to the way that the sort of societal trauma that we're exposed to affects our mental health, it also affects our spiritual health. And it takes us from a place of spiritual thriving to one of spiritual dryness or brokenness, that can impact the way that we behave. It can impact our relationships with God, with others, even with ourselves, and also with the world around us. And so, yeah, spirituality is just the kind of study of conversation about all of that. This part of what it means to be human, that we can't quite pin down to a physical reality, and yet is still very present with us every day, and that really has a lot of impact on our daily lives. And so, yeah, I think spiritual health is something that people in our society don't spend a lot of time thinking about. A lot of people do, thankfully, as the conversation continues to have less stigma and become more mainstream about mental health. A lot of people have started to think more about their mental health, which is beautiful, and I hope will continue. And I feel like we're moving to a place where spirituality as a concept is beginning to be talked about more. And yet still, I think a lot of people, even churchgoers, even people who have been religious their entire lives, don't really think about their spiritual health. And that is the work of spiritual direction. How do we spend intentional time together thinking about spirituality and thinking about the impact of our spiritual lives on the rest of our lives, and thinking about ways to strengthen our spirituality. And so that's my work as a spiritual director. It is parallel for sure with therapy. I think for a lot of people it feels therapeutic, and yet it's its own distinct practice that is not clinical, but it is relational. And that's some of the distinction that we make there.
That's super helpful. Thank you. So let's kind of get into the well. Let's take us back to March 2021.
That's right.
And yeah, like tell us, how the well came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start, and then I'll pass the microphone to Elizabeth to kind of fill in some of the gaps there, and also talk about how crazy it is to be my friend. Because you get middle of the night phone calls and big questions. So I, in 2021, was serving at a church in Apex. And if you know about Apex, it is sort of like a suburb of a suburb, kind of, but definitely is growing, big place. And it's also a very wealthy, privileged area, right? I think the average house cost in Apex is like $650,000. So, I mean, people make a lot of money in Apex. They work a lot. They are very successful on the whole, right? And like any place, there's variety. But I was serving a church where a lot of these privileged people were attending. And these were the folks whose families I was engaging with during COVID, which was, as we all know, a really traumatic, really hard, isolating time for all of us, really hard on everybody's mental health, everybody's spiritual health. But in my unique position, I was just realizing how even for these privileged people, there were so many barriers to good, especially mental health care. Even when you have money, even when you have health insurance, it can be hard to find the right therapist, not because there are not many good therapists out there, but because they are overwhelmed with the number of people who need care. And so we, at our church, we're just constantly trying to find places to refer people out to. I mean, just like weekly, I was having conversations with parents. I was having conversations with teenagers, and with individuals about their great need for care, and just really, really struggling to find places where they could actually get in to see a therapist. And thankfully, things like telehealth have become more popular, in part thanks to COVID, right? Silver linings. So that has increased accessibility, and yet there's still way more need than there is care available. And so that was just the reality that I was like bathing in day and night during those, early days of COVID when we were still not leaving our houses, right? So I was just miring in this reality, and it was heavy. And I think with my past experience with mental health and mental illness, it was particularly heavy for me. And so one night, couldn't sleep, pretty standard anyway, but especially during that time. And I just sort of like had this like light bulb moment, epiphany. I was like, well, what am I doing? I know a therapist like really well, who is excellent. And like, we need to just brainstorm this problem together. And like, I am just so curious about what would it look like if we did this in the church? What if we created pathways for mental health care? That was sort of the seed of it at the time in the church. And so I texted Elizabeth, like 12:50. We went back and found the text. It's like really late at night. I texted Elizabeth. I'm like, hey, had this crazy idea. Maybe we can talk tomorrow. I know it's late. And Elizabeth texted me back and was like, actually, I'm awake too. Do you want to talk now? And so approaching 1 a.m. in March of 2021, we got on the phone. Elizabeth was not living in North Carolina at the time, so there was a time difference. I mean, it was crazy. And I sort of posed this question. I'm like, crazy idea. What if we created a practice of mental health in the church? Not that we're the first people to ever ask that question, but I think we were the first people to ask it and say, like, how do we bring the wholeness of who we are into that practice? And how do we create a model that might be usable in lots of different contexts in the church? And so that was the call that started it all. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that night and what happened afterward.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Definitely a big fan, just so it's on the record, of getting late night calls about starting a nonprofit with my best friend. So always here for it. I think I was just deeply compelled by this idea of, one, getting to work together, because I've been so deeply formed by our friendship, and then to bring our professional work together and to really do something beautiful that is not often done. It is very rare to see a deeply spiritual but non-religious queer individual who's an EMDR trained therapist doing really deconstructed community-based participatory research and clinical work to come together with an ordained pastor and say, how do we build bridges between spiritual and mental health? Because we are these integrated, holistic, biological, psychological, social, spiritual beings. And so immediately, as I was finishing my PhD in Iowa at the time, I said, how do we start to take steps, and how do we do this responsibly? Amanda and I have always been really aware of the intersections of our identity and the privileges we hold as highly educated individuals and white individuals in the society, and also the ways that we have, faced oppression or marginalization as AFAB individuals and queer individuals, or a queer individual and a woman working in ministry. And so we wanted to really go slowly and responsibly and really get a feel for what does the local community here in Raleigh actually need? Would we be filling a need? And how do we build sustainable, collaborative, community-based partnerships so that we can be deeply embedded and connected to those around us without infringing our expectations, our plans, what we think is right, but really saying we have this to offer if it feels right and good and if the timing is now. And I think what we found through this journey is astoundingly like yes after yes after yes, and doors opening that we never imagined would have opened, including the opportunity to be in partnership with Edenton Street United Methodist Church, which has just been this beautiful partnership that, started before our official launch, but especially this first year of being officially in business, to really be in partnership in downtown Raleigh. The positionality this has afforded us to be here in the community, to walk down the streets, to go to local restaurants, to invest in the women's, the Raleigh, the Women's Center, thank you so much, to start building collaborative relationships with Shaw University and University of Chapel Hill has just been incredibly profound. And I think we were both very hopeful and had a lot of energy going into this, but to see all of that come to fruition over time as people were really excited to partner with us in this work. And I think what it told us through this journey is we had a deep hunger to build these bridges because of how we were formed by mental health and mental illness and trauma and joy and friendship and, chosen family. And what we have really found is that people have a deep-seated hunger for the same. And I think that's why they're very compelled when they see us together, even if they don't know how to categorize us or make sense of us together. They're like, whatever's happening there, I think we want to be a part of it. And so they keep saying yes. And that is a huge privilege and gift that we have been given by this community and this church.
Well, you said that you were trying to make sure that there was the need. Talk to us a little bit about the need.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't too hard to determine that there is need in Raleigh, as really nationwide research shows that there's need absolutely everywhere. So all we had to do was the tiniest bit of research about mental health in Raleigh and mental health everywhere to realize this need is great. And I think what we've come to find in our first year of operation, we have sort of worked with, supported. Now our count is more than 100 people in our first year, which, for us as a very small practice, that feels like a really great sort of benchmark for us. And those 100 people have participated in therapy and counseling, spiritual direction, life coaching, and then community classes. And those are the 4 services that we offer right now. And what we found with those people is that there's need in every one of those areas. And all of them intersect with each other, right? So there is absolutely need for good mental health care. And so we offer clinical mental health care by licensed professionals, I should say. And so that is just sort of the baseline. But we also understand people are spiritual. And so we also offer spiritual direction to meet those needs. And we also offer life coaching, which sort of brings in almost a professional sort of aspect to it, as well as a relational aspect to this work, a little less clinically and again, more relationally. And then there's also this great need for community. I think a huge issue, the Surgeon General would describe it as the epidemic of loneliness, right? So we are in a society that's increasingly isolated, increasingly disconnected. And so we've also found the need for mental health care, the need for spiritual care, the need for support, but also the need for community. And so that's kind of why we offer those community classes is really to meet that other need that has emerged as we've continued to try to get a sense of what is the scope of what people actually need and want in Raleigh. The exciting thing is, I think that this model that we've created would work contextually in lots of different kinds of communities, right? So we've done this work for Raleigh specifically. It is contextualized here. And I think this need is everywhere and it's so great.
I think just to build off of that, one of the ways that we assess need was also within churches. And so a lot of times we don't think about how to use church buildings, which have spaces that sit empty throughout days of the week, if they're not being used for worship and Bible studies and the like. And so part of our working model is also to offer, the United Methodist Church Conference, this working model of what does it look like to have bivocational pastors that are also maybe trained spiritual directors, and what does it look like to use your space in a versatile way where you're generating funds. So we pay rent to rent some of these facilities and spaces here. So that's helping offset some of those church costs. It's helping offset some of the costs to have an appointed pastor who also has income coming from another source. And that's so important in our society right now for the life of the church, which at large is kind of struggling to find traction and to invite community in, especially to reach younger generations who are very clearly saying, historically, you have said people like me, that look like me, that sound like me, that carry held identities like me, don't belong in these spaces. Especially if I have mental health concerns or needs. And so what does it look like for churches to start to deconstruct their models, their financial models, and also their working community-based models to say, hey, there are all of these, trained therapists that would be so happy if they felt like a church was a safe place to bring their clients into. So one of the big parts of the conversation Amanda and I had when discerning this shared call to work with Edenton Street is Edenton Street a safe place, a reconciled place to bring in, to work in as a queer person and to invite in other individuals with one or more held historically and present day marginalized and oppressed identities? And the answer was yes. And that has continued to be lived through the values of Edenton Street and our business and the partnership between the two. And I really hope, and I think Amanda and I hope to see hubs like the Well start to develop in other churches that have the space and want to really have this deep-seated desire to foster community wholeness through collaborative relationships with therapists.
And we're so grateful for the ways that Edenton Street has been doing this work long before we got here, right? Like we, through your ministry, Renee, and through the ministry of so many others, Edenton Street really is a model of what it looks like to be engaged in work with the community in meaningful ways that address needs, that really ask the question, like, what is the need and how can we come alongside? And so it was such a joy and a privilege and an exciting thing for us when this door opened, just because of the long history that Edenton Street has in downtown Raleigh on this corner of being a place not just for worship, although we do that and we do it well, if I do say so myself, but also all of these other ways that we're engaged in local and global ministry together, and with other partners in the community. I mean, if we sat here on this podcast and listed all of the partners that Edenton Street has, the Well is one of many, many, many. And it really, for us as an organization, as a nonprofit, it feels like truly a privilege to be located here, and not just to be located here, but to be a partner in this ongoing work that this church has done for centuries.
Well, we are so blessed to have you all here. And you're talking about the importance of community and belonging. I know belonging is one of your values.
That's right.
And how did y'all land on your values, and how do they play into your approach to your work?
This is a great question. We did, so timeline here, March 2021 was sort of the origin of the Well as a concept. We launched last January, a year ago, in January of 24. And so we really had almost 3 years of discernment, of conversations. I mean, we probably had, 1,000 conversations about what the Well could be and what it should be, and what it felt like the community needed, all of that stuff. And so really these values are the ones that sort of floated to the top in those conversations. And then especially when we started to have conversations with folks here at Edenton Street, we just saw so much synergy, which is like a cool word to use, synergy. But I think it's really true. And so we have really 4 different sets of values. Healing and wholeness, kind of the obvious one. That's a huge part of our mission statement, which really guides everything that we do. So much like the church, our mission is what we sort of measure everything else against. And that is just the Well exists to create pathways toward healing and wholeness in the community by offering accessible and affordable mental and spiritual care, which you've heard all about already. But also guiding our work are our values: healing and wholeness, accessibility of care. Obviously, that's a pretty standard one for the work that we're doing. But also social justice and equity to us felt really important. Elizabeth mentioned, we're hyper aware of the privilege that we bring into this work as white people, as educated people, and in other ways that we carry privilege as individuals. And we didn't want to do this in a way that would prevent justice or prevent equity, or would be just for some and not for all. And so for us, that social justice and equity value is a huge sort of guiding force for us. And then the last one is belonging. I mean, we've talked about just the great need for connection and community, and for the ways that many, many people in our world, but right here in Raleigh, are desperate to belong somewhere, to be claimed. And we see that in our Christian faith, that we have this claim on each other. We do belong to each other. God has given us to each other. And so part of what we want to do at the Well is just help people, regardless of who they are and where they come from and how healthy they are, just to know that they belong, and they belong to us. So
I love that.
Those are the values that really bubbled up in our conversations.
Well, and I love you say, about connection. And as we have been doing our visioning for the next 10 years, and we the theme is that we are called to connection, and we all are. And I know at the launch, which we're coming up, was January 25th.
That's right, January 25th. So 1 year ago.
One of the quotes that I kind of was trying to remember and write down. It was we wanted to, you all as the Well want to be a place where the disconnected can find connection and
That's
reconnection.
Right. Yeah.
And I love that, and I love how that parallels with what we want to do as a church.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question about one of the goals is to break down the barriers for accessibility and affordability. Can you just tell us a little bit how you're going about that?
Yeah, happy to tackle that one. So just a little bit of back context. My work was deeply formed by first, as a clinician, having an individual LLC where I said, how can I really break down these barriers? And so I was deeply formed by not accepting insurance and doing a really low sliding scale from $30 upward. And it's really rare to see clinicians accept that low of funds for an hour-long therapy session for a lot of reasons. We also have to have a living and be able to pay bills. And I think there's a way to do that sustainably. There's a way to have some clients that are higher paying to offset those lower paying clients, right? And so a lot of my work and training as a community-based participatory research and HRSA fellow, where I was really taught how to go into rural, underserved, marginalized communities and build sustainable collaborative relationships, then carried over into this clinical work and the model that Amanda and I adopted in part. So a big part of what we have done is say, how do we gain access to funds through grant funding, fundraising, scholarships, through being a clinical placement site for interns who can provide free services so that we can pay our providers equitably, have a reserve of funds to cover the cost of therapy, spiritual direction, life coaching, and group classes, and still ensure that that's not going to cost our providers so that they can continue to do this sustainably. And so a big part of our working model has been, where are those funds? Those funds are out there in our society, sometimes underutilized. And Amanda and I, that's how we can also leverage our privilege responsibly and our power responsibly to say, we know how to apply for these funds, and we know how to create kind of a streamline of funds coming into the Well through our community-based connections in a way that won't cost the community a lot, but really help offset the cost of mental health care services and spiritual services for our local community members. Anything else that I forgot that you...
Yeah, no, that was perfect. Yeah, so financial accessibility is really the biggest thing, but also just literal accessibility, right? Edenton Street is big, wonderful building that is easy to find in downtown Raleigh. There is parking. We've got all kinds of bathrooms. We are wheelchair accessible, right? So there's a physical sort of accessibility about it too. And then I think the final piece for us of accessibility is also just social accessibility, right? Like having the barriers of stigma reduced such that it is acceptable, and not just acceptable, but like celebrated, that we're seeking care and support, and we seek care and support physically when we're sick, right? So why would we not also do that mentally or spiritually or relationally when we're struggling in those ways too? And so, yeah, I think we just really see our work as barrier removing, and that's very biblical, right? Like we see Jesus doing that all the time. This coming Sunday, we have Jesus picking up the text from Isaiah and saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me and is empowering me to preach good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty all those who are oppressed, and to announce the time of the Lord's favor." And really, for me as a Christian, that and for Elizabeth as someone who deeply respects and loves Jesus too, even as a non-Christian person, like that, those words are so formative for the work that we're doing, and it's really deeply grounded in that Christian tradition of liberating and removing any block to wholeness, which is another word for salvation.
Well, one of my questions was going to be, why should Christians care?
Well,
I think you've answered that,
yes,
and I think Jesus, it's pretty clear, and that we are here to love our neighbors, and just
right.
as we would love ourselves, and we want ourselves to be whole and full as well.
That's exactly
we want
right.
our neighbors to have full, flourishing lives.
Absolutely. And I would just add on to that. That's why we landed on calling the well, because we were both deeply formed by the Samaritan woman at the well. And so when we think about where Jesus is located in the scriptures, he's with all of those who are marginalized and outcast by dominant discourses in society and who are often forgotten and disconnected, right? And so when we thought about what the purpose of a well serves in a community, it's a place of gathering to gain water, to literally drink in the, I was thinking, we'll have to edit this bit out. Not the blood of life.
Living water.
Living water, thank you.
I don't have to edit that out.
But to actually have access to living water.
Yeah.
And so when we think about a mental and spiritual healthcare center, we think about how are we providing living water for the spirit, for the mind, the body, for those who are seeking relationship deeply, especially for those who have either been harmed by Christianity and really trying to reconcile that harm, and maybe want to lean back in and say, I don't know how to lean into this. Where am I located in these stories? And we can immediately start with, well, let's talk about the story of the Samaritan woman at the well and how Jesus went to be with her specifically one-on-one. And that's the type of relationship healing we want to offer, one client at a time, one relationship at a time.
You talked about really having a heart for people who are marginalized, and you also mentioned the Women's Center. I'm just curious, like, how are you going about reaching out to letting people know that y'all even exist?
Yeah, great question. Really, we haven't had to try that hard because I think people are excited about it, and we've had just all of these folks come to us. Like, we just keep saying, like, God continues to send us exactly the right people at exactly the right time, people who we did not prepare for or even know existed. And so one of those people is our primary therapist, Greta, and she has amazing connections at Shaw University at the Women's Center where she volunteers her time, and just, yeah, she has incredible connections in the community in Raleigh. And so, yeah, we have done things like pursue those connections that she already has. Some of the connections have come to us. Elizabeth mentioned we have a partnership with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We are right now hosting an intern from their School of Social Work, and we're getting ready next school year to host another intern. We just had someone reach out to us from Eastern Carolina University to inquire about that kind of partnership. And yeah, we're also doing just like some basic advertising and stuff like that. But we've had to kind of thread the needle a little bit because we are small and the need is so great, right? So we're trying to not be, just overwhelmed with requests that we actually can't address. And so we're trying to like very carefully get the word out in the right places to folks who need it, and also acknowledge that like we're still really small and we're still trying to figure out, a year in what it looks like to be balanced and to have appropriate caseloads and that kind of stuff.
So you say, you mentioned a year in. So what have been your greatest surprises, greatest challenges, and what are your hopes for the future?
Yeah, well, I'll speak to this first, and then I'd love to hear from you too, Elizabeth. But greatest surprises, again, is just how many doors get opened and how the timing has been right. Even when it hasn't felt right, it has been right. And I think the most fun surprise, I'll just briefly talk about Rabbi Dr. Lisa, who's was our intern and is now testing to become fully licensed as a pastoral counselor and psychotherapist. But she came to us through the grapevine. Some grandmothers at Edenton Street, talked to some other grandmothers outside of Edenton Street, and somehow the word got to Rabbi Dr. Lisa, who needed to complete an internship for her program. And so she came to us as an ordained rabbi and also as an OBGYN and a surgeon.
Wow.
And so who's just, rounding out her formation with yet another degree. She brought us literally her binder of like certifications and all of these things. She's amazing. And that came in, I think, October of 2023, before we had even launched. Like the well wasn't even really a thing. And Rabbi Dr. Lisa came to us and has just been an incredible partner who has already changed the well from what we started it to be, with her presence and with her gifts and with her vision for care for people holistically. And so it's just been really surprising to see person after person, connection after connection, door after door open for us in beautiful ways that we did not plan for. And for the future, I hope that we really will be able to perfect as much as we can this model here, and then offer it just in other places. We're not sure exactly what that looks like, but we've already had some preliminary conversations with other United Methodist churches in our conference here, but also some non-United Methodist churches. There's a Presbyterian church here in Raleigh. The pastor who told me, whenever you're ready, come talk to us, please. So there's a lot of excitement, a lot of energy around this model. And that's exciting for us because that was our intention. But I think the really exciting part of the future of that is just the number of people that could serve. So it's not about like amassing a huge model that makes a lot of money, right? We are a nonprofit. We're not about the money here. Like it is about maximizing this mission for the most number of people who really need care. So that's the exciting part for me is the future of making sure this model works, which I think it does, and then sharing it in ways that could be really fruitful in other communities too.
I will speak a little bit then to some of the challenges, and I'm going to give all the kudos to Amanda for her unyielding dedication to navigating us getting insurance coverage and being approved by different insurance panels and boards, so that we can not only offer sliding scales and free services through our grant funding so far, but also invite in clients that do have insurance coverage. And so our healthcare system is deeply broken and very challenging, and Amanda really has towed that line for us to say, we're going to do this. We can't really afford to outsource that, to have somebody else come in and get these panel approvals for us. And so she has really carried the burden of that work. And now we are approved on several different insurance panels. And so we are accepting clients literally from all walks of life with different healthcare coverages or lack thereof. And I think that has been deeply rewarding to watch and also very challenging. And it's a reminder that we signed up to do this work to remove some of those systemic barriers that are in place that are preventing people from having access to care. And this is exactly why it's preventing it. Even as two highly educated, trained individuals who are in our line of work and doing it well, it has been slow and hard at times. And we are happy to carry carry that burden so that other people can come into the space and receive the healing and community that they need. And I think it also goes to show it really takes people coming together to use their individual and shared resources, talents, and dedication. I mean, hours upon hours of phone calls and emails and searching and self-educating to get to the point that we are now just in that one area. So I would say that has been a challenge that is worth tackling, a mountain that is worth climbing. And it's been a lot as two individuals who are bivocational and doing this work on top of the other work and missions and ministries and education that we are providing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you do both. You're pretty busy people. So I don't even know that you have spare time, but to make spare time when you don't have spare time is pretty amazing. What are some upcoming things that people should know about and how to get involved? And just, what are the ways for people to join either in the work of the well, or if we're struggling and we might want to connect with the well ourselves? How do we go about that?
Absolutely. Well, a couple of different things that I'm going to highlight really quickly for us as we're getting ready to wrap up. The first is that we do offer therapy and counseling and spiritual direction and life coaching to individual adults. We're not at the place where we can offer that for children and teens yet, although we would love to get there someday. So we do individual adult therapy, counseling, spiritual direction, life coaching. We also offer community classes every semester, usually fall, spring, summer, more in the fall and the spring, and slightly fewer in the summer. This spring, we actually have 3 classes coming up, which I just want to make a quick plug for. One is called The Practices of Spiritual Growth and Formation, pretty self-explanatory, but for anybody who's looking to deepen their practices in their spirituality, and that's taught by Reverend Joyce Kaufman, and that'll get started in March. And there's also another that she's teaching. This is actually a virtual class called Midlife Aging as a Spiritual Practice. We've done some just aging as a spiritual practice courses for folks who are retired. But what we've found is that there are folks who are still working who are aging and are trying to figure out how to do that in ways that are spiritual and healthy and good. And so Reverend Joyce Kaufman is also teaching that course. And then Dr. Elizabeth Waters is teaching a class called Reclaiming Yourself, A Journey Toward Emotional Healing, using a very provocative book entitled Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson, which is an incredible book that is really aimed at healing relationally and emotionally. So lots of opportunities for community classes this spring. And if you're interested in any of that, any of those services that I just mentioned, best place to go is our website, thewellmentalandspiritualcare.org. It's a mouthful, all spelled out. Or you can send me an email. You can use our email at the well or my email at Edenton Street, and I can forward it. We're good. But the well email is just info at thewellmentalandspiritualcare.org, and we would love to hear from you and connect with you. The last opportunity I want to mention as we wrap up is we have a community engagement and fundraising team. And that team is really not just about fundraising, although that is obviously a part of it as a nonprofit and with our particular model. But also we are looking for people who are interested in serving and supporting the work of the well. We have so many, we have a handful of wonderful people already, some from the church, some from the community who are serving on that team. But there is room for more people who are passionate about mental and spiritual care and would love to find creative ways to further what we're doing at the well. So those are our opportunities right now for how to get engaged and how to support the work that we're doing.
Wonderful. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Just want to say thank you. Thanks for creating this space for us to tell our story. And obviously a huge thanks to Edenton Street and for the ways that this partnership has already been so fruitful in our first year. And we look forward to all the years to come.
Well, thank you. We are so thankful for the two of you and all the practitioners at the well and our partnership, and for your hearts for really wanting wholeness and flourishing and thriving for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee.